Yep.
Hello, this is Jeff Gaudiosi, and you're on misplacedstraws.com, where music comes to life. My guest today is making his fourth appearance on the site, but this is the first time we actually get to talk face to face. He's about to release his 27th solo record called Surrender of Silence, which is actually his second release so far this year. Please welcome the one and only Steve Hackett. Welcome, Steve.
Hi there, Jeff. How are you? How are you
I'm
doing?
doing great. So earlier this year, we spoke as you were releasing just the beautiful Under a Mediterranean Sky. And that was the first time that you really put a record together remotely, thanks to the pandemic. Is it safe to say that since you followed it up so quickly that you're kind of embracing this new way of making a record?
Well, yeah, I think so. The idea of working at home and it's almost like kind of being a satellite, isn't it? Um, Performances are being beamed in from everywhere, and whereas at one time records were made with people face to face, when you're trying to work with someone from Azerbaijan who's connecting you with someone from Tajikistan, and you've got a drummer in the States, um, you're working with this kind of United Nations approach, and to travel has been, a musician's birthright for hundreds of years, and then suddenly we're like sort of, in terms of social conditions, we're back in, the era of the Black Death, the plague, and
Yeah.
so do we allow ourselves to be ground to a halt? How does it work for filmmakers? God knows. But one studio is the size of one's computer,
Mhm.
and it is possible for people to fly in their performances, and many of these performances have been world class, and
Yeah.
so it makes a record possible under these conditions,
Mhm.
but it's had to be more of a test tube baby than the act of getting together, all making love in one room together, making music together. It's not been quite like that.
Yeah.
These are different times, but it's made for some very different kind of sounding efforts
Mhm.
from us all.
And the last record was classical nylon string. This record, Surrender of Silence, is undoubtedly a rock record, but it
Yeah,
still has a lot of those classical elements in it. The
yeah,
beginning part of relaxation music for sharks, the drums
yes,
and the strings. Did
yeah.
some of the writing of the two records kind of bleed together because they're so close?
Well, if I'm honest, ever since the Beatles started working with orchestras, it changed my mind about what was possible,
Mhm.
or what was credible for a rock act to do. Um, it might sound like heresy, but see, I grew up listening to rock. I listened to blues, R&B. That was the tradition I came from. But at
Mhm.
the same time, I was listening to Segovia and classical music, like a guilty pleasure, thinking, um, yeah, I love this stuff, but it's not going to impact upon rock. And then it did
Mhm.
towards the end of the 1960s, and really from 67, perhaps 66, 67, um, where people were showing their classical leanings. Um, I thought in a way that music would continue in that way, but
Mhm.
instead of which it's become ever more homegrown. So most people these days make a record with just two people.
Yeah.
You know, the the uh, the programmer is probably the producer, and the singer is someone else,
Mhm.
and they come together and they make a hit record. That's what
Mhm.
they do. Where does that leave the rest of us who've spent a lifetime working on our craft?
Yeah.
And where does it leave music? It leaves music impoverished, and you have to look to these other genres to dress the music differently, I think.
Mhm.
And then there's been the whole sort of phenomenon of so-called world music,
Mhm.
and I allow that to affect me because I love working with friends from all over the world, whether they play the tar, the dutar, the sitar, the guitar, the drums. whatever, a lot of these things may be unfamiliar instruments to some. And so it's been an education for me, just working with pals all over the world and in different styles. So on one level, I'm working with a Vietnamese instrument that I learned to play on the beginning of one track. Um, and so it goes on. And then the same theme is taken up by a lady playing the viola, playing it in an Oriental style. And it makes for almost like a sort of soundtrack to an imaginary movie, but the movie is for the ear rather than the eye. Although I'm involved in funnily enough, videos these days. A lot of the time it gets farmed out because I can't possibly do everything myself. But there's been some interesting videos that have come up already around this album, and there's a new one that I've just seen that a cartoon maker has done around the track Natalia, and we've gone to town with the Russian sort of oppressive regime thing, and that looks really quite stunning. And I'm very interested in the different approaches that different filmmakers have to these things.
Yeah, and you mentioned the influence of world music and different types of instruments. And over your last 3 or 4 records, you've really began to explore that and sort of expand the boundaries of what we consider to be prog rock by bringing in all of these different elements. And as we spoke last time, you and your wife love to travel and you like to bring all of that into it. And with songs like Natalia and Wing Beats and Shanghai to Samarkand, is your love of travel influenced by world music, or is world music influenced by your love of travel?
Where does one begin? And is it the journey that makes the song, or does the song facilitate the journey? The world beckons. It's a strange thing. I first started traveling when I was a 7-year-old boy. My parents emigrated to Canada. They didn't have any money. It was assisted passage. Mother became instantly homesick, knew she wanted to return. But in a way, in my imagination, I couldn't forget that extraordinary journey across the Atlantic, seeing icebergs firsthand, seeing the Rocky Mountains, traveling through them from the observation dome, and seeing the world, the prairie, the ocean, the sky. I grew up in concrete London. There were very few trees. We lived opposite the Battersea Power Station, made famous so many years later by Pink Floyd with the Flying Pig, but we were in the middle of pollution central. Since then, partly as a touring musician, I've visited so many parts of the world, but there are many things that are not on the touring map for musicians, but are equally fascinating to visit. China, where else have we been? Ethiopia, Greece, places that I've not performed in, but nonetheless have influenced the music. The Orient, certainly. I've traveled not just with my band, but also with a world fusion band called Jabe, Hungarian guys. So we were in Malaysia, in Penang Island, and you hear music, and it's very different from the kind of stuff that you go and see at your local blues club. It's very different. Nothing wrong with the local blues club or pub. I love it. All the sonic developments that happened with the world of guitar happened around blues, largely in London when I was growing up in the mid-60s. But beyond all of that, I got introduced to so many other things, despite myself at times. Whenever I thought to myself, I don't really want to travel, something will always happen. An offer will come up. My wife will say, well, let's visit Borneo. Let's go to Vietnam. These things are on on the list. But so far, she managed to take me to India, to Cambodia, extraordinary trips. Each one of them a trip of a lifetime. Egypt, we had a trip to Egypt. Some of it influenced under a Mediterranean sky. We were able to inform that with musical styles from that region, and again, as I said, unfamiliar instruments. So it's a leap into the unknown, and it's wonderful when it's a bit like the toys or the instruments lead the dance. That's lovely, to create space for them to do their thing. Much in the same way as when I first joined Genesis, and even before. If I got a new fuzz box, I would want to write an ode to a fuzz box. Now it'll be, well, you've seen things beyond the fuzz box. There's things that are equally enthralling. I come back to the same humble instruments that I always had beforehand, but I used to think that anyone who owned a Marshall Stack and a Les Paul had already made it. You've got it. That's it. You know, you've already climbed Everest. You've got the tools. You know, this is what it's all about. You know, I was young and very much hungry for it then. And then perhaps priorities change over time, and I'm not that kid. You know, looking at shop windows, thinking I can't afford that. I desperately need it. You know, when is my fairy godmother going to wave the magic wand and I'm going to get to that? But over time, you beg, borrow, if not steal, to get to that stage.
Yeah, and you have some great musicians on this record. You mentioned you have musicians from all over the world, as well as using your regular touring band, and you also have some pretty special guests, including, for my money, one of the most underrated drummers in rock, Phil Ehart of Kansas. How did that come about? Do you and Phil go back a ways, or?
Oh yeah, we worked just after I left Genesis. Phil Ehart and Steve Walsh of Kansas were working with me on an album called Please Don't Touch, and we became pals. You know, we're all opposite sides of the pond, but Phil had stayed in touch with me and said, "Oh, if you have any songs at any point, you know, we're on the lookout for that." And then we were doing the cruise. We were doing Cruise to the Edge in recent times, and we'd always said we'd do something again at some point. So I sent him the track Shanghai to Samarkand, and he said he really liked the track, and he sent me some drum work on it. So it's a very kind of ambitious track. It's a kind of travelogue, but it has to be a virtual one, because those places have been inaccessible for a while. Everyone knows all about the way lockdown has impacted on their lives, but it doesn't mean to say that we have to stop work. Luckily, we're not slaves to the idea of going somewhere else into someone else's recording studio. A lot of us can work at home or in nearby facilities, and then we get a performance and somehow make it work by osmosis with the ideas that we've already got. So I think people are very used to working in isolation these days. I mean, I've worked on lots of other people's albums myself, and they send me something that's unfamiliar, and they don't have to sit there whilst I try and get to grips with the unfamiliar. I just send them the finished thing, the finished idea, and if they like what I've done, they use it. Most of the time, I find that it can almost be a distraction working with the genius who's written something, you know, who knows exactly how it ought to sound. That could be a hindrance, whereas I will color it in my way, and I leave other people to do the same thing with things with just the briefest idea. Say, oh, this is an energetic drum part. Would you like to play busy or slow or atmospherically? And just let people who are world class get on with the job, and I get something once they've ironed out all the wrinkles.
And as much as this record and your last few are influenced by everything we've just talked about, just seeing the world and new instruments and new sounds, there's still some heavy guitar on this record.
Yeah.
The beginning, that intro to the Obliterati, Fox Tango.
Yeah.
So in addition to the orchestral stuff and bringing in these sounds from all over the world, every now and then, do you still enjoy picking up the Les Paul and being a guitar hero?
Oh, well, I think the playing has gotten more heroic in recent times. I think the playing's probably gotten angrier as I've worked on more and more techniques, things that I couldn't do at one time. And I've given, full vent to that. I've allowed that to be the case. There's still the melodic things. Melodic playing is where I came in. But sometimes I like to just have a complete rant on the guitar. And if it's an angry song, like Fox's Tango, you mentioned, where there's social comment, various things, or the Obliterati, which uses tapping. Which, it was something I was doing right back in 1971, that technique. And I thought, I'll do something that's a nod to that early era of the early 70s. And when I was doing Acolyte, I used a sort of phase thing. I used an MXR phaser on the, which is an old piece of kit now, on it, so that it's kind of going through this phase shift whilst you're tapping. So the sound is being colored by repeat echo, probably repeat echo, reverb, and distortion. So there's all of those things, and the notes are flying thick and fast, and the changes are almost Wagnerian, to be honest, more than rock and roll. And it's got the support of strings, and I think of the cimbasso. It's an orchestral instrument that is incredibly deep. So it's the sort of thing that you'll find in orchestras. It's really low, rasping sound that mixes very well with orchestral basses and what have you. So yeah, there's still a rock and roller in there. Me, I'm still an electric player. I'm still a guitarist, is what I'm trying to say.
And one of my favorite tracks on the record is Devil's Cathedral, which features your touring vocalist, Nad Sylvan.
Yeah.
And live, Nad handles the Genesis material. And I think this track kind of fits into that mold.
Yes.
But when it comes to putting together your solo records, do you try to keep that Genesis sound with Nad and that live band separate from where you're going with your solo work, where you handle most of the vocal?
Well, I'd say there's one song that is, I would say, typically Genesis. I think it's the sort of thing that would have fitted perhaps into the era of Selling England by the Pound, 1973. The idea of narrative, an invented story, a character who wants to take over the life of somebody else. They are an understudy, a stand-in, and in the story, the imagined story, this guy ends up taking the life of this particular person and then marrying the wife. The implication being that the wife had no idea that this guy was responsible for that. And it's a kind of demonic idea, a demonic story of unbridled ambition. But at the same time, we've used some typically Genesis devices of something that starts off acoustically and then becomes, full-on electric band, but it also has, you know, pipe organ at the beginning and soprano sax, and they're doing this thing called octatonics, and they are runs that I didn't recognize at first that Rob and Roger were doing together. And I thought, I've got to have some of that, you know. I mean, it sounded like some of the most dissonant stuff imaginable, and we were playing it pretty loud at home, and the dog next door was barking furiously, and I thought, yeah, I could even have the dog on this as well, you know. It's like this thing going on, and it was hugely entertaining, but it's very, very challenging. And then it becomes a song. The rest of the band kick in, and I gave it to Nad because I said, Nad, you know, you might be good at this. You could use your theatrical style on this, whereas, you know, I do some of the rock singing on this album myself, but also, you know, I think that I'm part of a team of singers where, you know, I have a mandolin twinning me on a lot of things, so we get the male-female thing. So at times we sound a little bit like Yes together, you know, when we're doing these harmonies. Other times I'll do some full-on rock singing myself. But you know, it's kind of horses for courses. I thought Nad will be right for this. It'll have a Genesis feel, and no one's really heard this yet, other than yourself and a few others. So this is not released yet, but we're doing it as part of the new show that will feature. Yeah, we'll be doing that one, and Held in the Shadows, another one from the new album, plus some older solo stuff, plus the whole of Seconds Out, which is a very long double album, and we're doing full-length versions of those Genesis tunes. So I try to address the present and the past, to keep a balance. For those who like their music to be familiar, they will have that. For those who like their music to be challenging and cutting edge, I believe we deliver that too.
You just told the story behind the lyrics with Devil's Cathedral. And I think as your solo career has evolved, your lyrics have really kind of taken on that cinematic quality, or, you know, a novel. You know, you recently put out your autobiography, which was fantastic. I have a copy right behind me over there. And, you know, and it did really well. Have you ever thought about just writing, whether it's putting out short stories or a book or a film, as you've gotten deeper and deeper with your lyrics?
Well, when I met my wife Jo, originally she was making movies, and I said I would be happy, you know, to do, you know, music for her with that, and she ended up writing a couple of books, and I would encourage that as she encouraged me with writing. So we've talked about collaborations beyond the collaboration that goes with songwriting. But I think I've realized that the songs that perhaps I'm most drawn to, the ones that really last for me, have a kind of narrative quality to them. And I was reading an old interview that Paul McCartney gave in the 1960s. I think it was for Life magazine, and he was saying something about he'd gone somewhere and he'd taken along John Lennon to a place, I think it was the Times bookshop or something, and they saw the original manuscript of Under Milk Wood by Dylan Thomas. Eleanor Rigby has a quality to it. The famous line about wearing a face that she keeps in a jar by the door is something that was very Dylan Thomas-esque in a way, because he would allude to certain things with the characters, but the use of metaphor was important for him as a writer whether it will be as innuendo, because there's a
Mm.
lot of it with Under No Wood. It's essentially, the sensual life, the subconscious sensual life
Mm.
of um, a Welsh town or village, and I found it fascinating that he would have certain things like, this woman who never goes out, this woman married to a man who never takes her out, and he's the milkman, and one of the characters says, I think he keeps her in the cupboard with the empties.
Mm.
And so there's this aspect of what informed the Beatles is there
Right.
in English literature, maybe a few years earlier. Not that much, just the difference perhaps between the 1950s and the early 60s, and
Mm.
by the mid 1960s, the influence of the other Dylan, of course, is
Mm.
paramount upon the Beatles,
Mm.
and narrative seems to be so much part and parcel of really good writing. Genesis addressed that. Um, at sometimes it was deliberately obscurantist,
Mm.
but at other times you would get the idea of what that's all about without needing to have something written underneath
Yeah.
to tell you what the lyrics were all
Mm.
about. Because I think that ideally a song should be self-explanatory.
Mm.
So once you catch the words, and I try not to write too many words that are impossible to catch first time
Mm.
on first listening.
Mm.
Um, but I think you can be inventive with this stuff. You can push the boat out.
Mm.
You can make it your own. It's a folk tradition in a way, isn't it?
Mm.
Telling stories.
Right. Definitely. And as we're recording this, it's been
Mhm.
less than 24 hours since we heard the news of the passing of Charlie Watts.
Oh, I know.
Yeah. In the early days, did you ever have any interaction? Genesis and the Stones ever do festivals or anything like that together way back when?
No, I met two of the Stones over time,
Mm-hmm.
and spoke with them. And one was Mick, and the other one was Bill Wyman.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I found them very talkative, very communicative, and and it was nice, that they were childhood heroes of mine. I was listening to the Stones very, very early on, and I loved their work and practiced along with it relentlessly.
Yeah.
Um, so yes, the passing of Charlie is, yeah, it saddens me because when I was a kid, I desperately wanted to have the long hair that they had, and I thought out of all of them, Charlie was the most handsome. I thought he had this kind of face that could have belonged to. He could have been an Indian brave. Can I use that word?
Yes.
Indigenous
Yeah.
American, they do this, that, and the other. Yeah, I mean, he looked like he could have been, an honourable chief of
Mhm.
some tribe um, that we could only guess at, and his face really personified the Stone Age aspect of them. He looked chiseled,
Mhm.
and so to see him pass, it's sobering. But
Mhm.
obviously, I still have a soft spot for the Stones. I think that there was a side of me as a kid who was always hoping that the Stones might give me a call one day. It never happened because there were 1,000 other guitarists who were keen
Mhm.
on getting the job.
Mhm.
Not to mention harmonica players.
Yeah.
So and I possessed both skills, but it was interesting. The early Stones, I think, were perhaps a tad more experimental,
Mhm.
and I enjoyed them for that. I
Mhm.
loved Painted Black, for instance. Loved the use of sitar, the whole rhythmic thing. It doesn't put a foot wrong. It's absolutely in the groove. It's in the moment. It's in the pocket with a very dark lyric, um, and a fantastic groove.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I think that I think he was a great drummer. He's also a jazz drummer, and I think his love was jazz. I can
Mhm.
understand that because you'd get a pulse from something which would seem impossibly fast.
Yeah.
And I suspect that, energizing jazz was perhaps maybe what he was all about. I don't know him well enough to be able to say, was he of the Elvin Jones school? Was he of the Buddy Rich school?
Mm-hmm.
All I know is that most drummers that I've talked to mention Buddy Rich in terms of saying, well, yeah, this was the gospel handed down.
Yeah.
So anyway, the passing of a great, and I shall be listening to all those Stones tunes ever more fondly, thinking, yep, I missed my chance to work with the great Charlie Watts.
Yeah. Well, we've been spending some time here with the amazing Steve Hackett and his great new solo record called Surrender of Silence, which is out everywhere on September 27th. I know you have some colored vinyl and signed copies and things like that off of your website. So definitely encourage everyone to check it out. It really is. I think it's probably your best solo record. One of my favorites. So
thank you so much.
Definitely looking forward to being able to catch you on the road when the world opens up again and you're able to come back stateside.
Thank you so much. Yes, me too. I'm missing it like crazy. We start off in the UK, and we'll sort of we'll be back in force next year everywhere else.
Well, Steve, thank you so much. Best of luck with the new record, and I have no doubt we'll be talking soon as you continue along the way.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Lovely talking to you.
Yep. Bye.
All the best.